So good evening. I'm Graham Allison, the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And let me welcome you to what promises to be a great opportunity to explore an amazing topic with an even more amazing panel. So we're celebrating the publication of a report from the Belfer Center by David Petraeus and Bhayani called The Next Great Emerging Market, Capitalizing on North America's Four Interlocking Revolutions. This is a project David has been pursuing here at Harvard over the last several years, and it's come to fruition. You can find it on the Belfer Center website, or in the program you'll get some clues to it. But tonight we're going to take some of the tips of the iceberg. So these these three members of the panel hardly need an introduction, and you have your program. We'd say about David, who's the principal author of the report, that we're very proud that he's counted as a senior fellow here at the Belfer Center, where he's been for the past 3 years. He's, for most of us, and me in particular, a great American hero. He's the most successful modern American general. And he's now puts some part of his mind into broader public policy issues, where over the course of a great career in government and now after government, he's shown a special, I would say, from my perspective, insight into the intersections of issues and public policy choices, of which you could hardly have a better set than the one we're dealing with tonight. So his co-author in this report, who started as the research assistant on it, is a great example of Harvard students. Since he graduated from the business school just in June, he worked with David on this report over the past year. And Bhayani is now a consultant, but he did such good work on the report that David said, how about we make him a co-author? And I said, well, you're the author, your choice, and he did. So this is a high standard to which other Kennedy School students can aspire as they work with other senior fellows or faculty.
It helps if they're the former managing editor of the Harvard Crimson as well.
It
enhances their chance.
He has many skills. And last and certainly not least is our colleague and friend, Susan Hockfield. Susan is a great leader of an educational institution. I can't remember the name of it, but it's not very far down the river.
Just 3 letters, very simple.
And has been fascinated by the intersections of science and technology and the rest of society. And among other things, gave here in this forum the Godwin Lectures last year, helping us understand the convergence of the life sciences on the one hand and engineering on the other. And Susan has been a member with Megan O'Sullivan of the advisory committee of the project of which this is the product. So in any case, the way the game is going to go tonight, I'm going to ask questions for the first half hour or 45 minutes that I think would engage us in a discussion. And the members of the panel obviously speak up about any point that you agree or disagree. And then we'll go to the audience for questions. So the topic of the report, as I said before, is capitalizing on North America's four interlocking revolutions. So David, if you were giving us your elevator speech version, sort of in brief for those who haven't had the opportunity to read it, what's the meat?
Well, first of all, let me just thank you for the kind words. Let me thank you for your polite, unyielding persistence in nudging me along on this project, for finding this great co-author. And thanks for scheduling a forum session early in the semester when people still have inquisitiveness and time on their hands before they get into their semester papers and so forth. You know, I was a grad student and I experienced the same thing. The bottom line here is best expressed, I think, by going back to a question I got in a conference in London about 2 years ago when I was asked, after the American century, what? And they expected, I think, that I would say, well, the Asian century or perhaps even the Chinese century. And instead, I said the North American decades. Now, it's decades, that's an S on the end, and it's North America, not just the United States of America, though the US is at the core of this. But it really comes down to fundamentals plus 4 revolutions, and then relative to what's going on in the rest of the world. I do have, you know, a day job. I'm the chairman of the KKR Global Institute. It's a global private investment firm. And we look at these kinds of trends. And all the way back when I was the director of the CIA, we were trying to predict the price of Brent crude after the next round of Iranian oil sanctions, we saw the energy revolution. And it has had a transformative effect on energy markets. And despite 1 million barrels per day of Iranian oil coming off the market because of sanctions, despite another up to 1 million coming out because of Libyan violence, prices have still gone down at the gas pump thanks to the energy revolution in the United States, the so-called shale gale, and the technologies that we invented for directional drilling, horizontal fracturing, and seismic big data that enable that. But beyond the energy revolution, you've got the IT revolution, which really has enabled the final stage of the energy revolution and enables everything else, frankly, that is moving in the other 2 revolutions. The manufacturing revolution, the advent of much, much greater automation and robotics, and also elements like 3-dimensional printing, and then the life sciences revolution with stem cell technology, genetics, so forth and so on. And again, big data playing a huge role in that as well. And you then combine that, you put that in the United States, we're leading every one of these, or among the leaders of every one, in the sub-elements as well. And you link us with the 2 countries who've been joined ever more integrated for 21 years now with the North American Free Trade Agreement, to the point that a very modest-sized neighbor to the north is our #1 trading partner, not the colossal China or even the 3rd, 4th, or 5th largest economies. And then Mexico now is moving into 2nd place in one category and 3rd in the other. So we have 3 highly integrated economies. We have nearly 500 million people. We will in a few years. It's a very sizable market. We share a belief in the values of free market economics and democracy. We don't have historic, ethnic, or sectarian disputes as exist in so many other parts of the world. And in fact, you don't see Mexico asking China to pivot to North America to offset US hegemony or something like that. So there are real fundamentals here. And then you can get into macroeconomic fundamentals in a lot of ways and so forth. And when it's all compared to what? Compared to a slowing Chinese economy that we have seen coming for quite some time. Still going to grow enormously, still going to be a crucial part of the global economy, but is slowing and is going to continue to slow as it makes this transition from low-cost labor provider to the world to a domestic consumption and services economy. And then you look at the rest of the world, and frankly, it's very, very differentiated. The 2 economies are doing best of all of those, Germany and the UK, in a Eurozone, not the UK, of course, but Germany and the Eurozone, very, very differentiated. And it's very hard to find really bright, compelling spots elsewhere in the world. And you come back to the United States, you just keep coming back. And I think it's accurate to say that rumors of our demise were greatly exaggerated.
Good.
By the way, one other data point. This year, for the first year in 9 years, it appears that the United States will grow more in absolute dollar-denominated GDP than does China. That is a big deal because it means that the inevitability of these two lines crossing, coming soon to a theater near us is not quite coming so soon.
So David, let me get you to talk a little bit more about these 4 revolutions.
Sure.
And their interlocking. Because as you said, the first is what we're accustomed to, the IT revolution,
Yep.
the next generation of it, big data as an enabler, but the way in which that impacts the life sciences, Susan's the topic of the Godkin lecture, or the way in which the changes there, which are moving at a rate perhaps twice the rate of Moore's law, you look like, whoa,
Yep.
okay. Then you look at what's happening in the energy space. That's now become well known. That wasn't well known when you started this study.
No, I mean, it started
And then
4
the
years
advanced
ago.
manufacturing component
Yep.
is yet another
Yep.
that's somewhat enabled by the, so tell us a little bit about the interlocking.
Sure, let me do that briefly. If you look at advanced manufacturing, let's just take robotics as one element of it, or three-dimensional printing as another. Each of these involves huge software programs, enormous. And frankly, if you didn't have the scalable storage that's available now with the cloud computing, if you didn't have the enormous computing power also associated with that, and although it's not uniform throughout the country, the broadband speed to enable you to upload it, not just download, but the upload speed, if you didn't have all of these, and therefore the ability to share it with other people, all of whom are collaborating on this, you just could not do what we intend to do and are doing now with robotics and indeed with this massively increased automation, which is gradually going to replace humans doing repetitive tasks. It's already started. If you look at the life sciences, just take one area of that. In fact, I have a chair at the University of Southern California where I spend at least a week per semester. They are one of the great brain imaging centers in the entire world. And what has helped them achieve massive breakthroughs is just collecting more and more and more data on resections of brains so that they now can discern patterns. So you can see, tragically, those who have suffered true traumatic brain injuries, or by the way, in contact sports in many cases, you can absolutely now see the deterioration that has taken place, which also means that you can then at least try, to figure out how to use other elements of the life sciences revolution to either halt that or perhaps even reverse it over time. And Bob Belfer, God bless him, his name is on the Belfer Center, was talking earlier about the concerns that he has about the impact of Alzheimer's, just that disease alone on healthcare costs. This is the kind of initiative that can help you at least come to grips with the disease and perhaps at some point figure out how to at least slow it or stop it or maybe even reverse it.
So Susan, that's a pretty natural connection back to the Godkin lecture thesis, but let me push a little step beyond that. So if you want to go to the forum's website, they have all the forums that you can watch the videos of. There was a terrific forum here with Susan last year on the integration of the life sciences and synthetic biology on the one hand and engineering on the other. So one product of that might be not only better diagnostics, but even more targeted medicines you talked about, and also maybe new organs, and then maybe new. So tell us a little bit about that piece of it and the public policies, because that's really the place where it intersects with the Kennedy School, the public policies that either impede or accelerate this.
Yeah. So, not to re-give the Godkin lecture, although I'm sure each of you has another hour to spare this evening.
Go to the video, it's certainly worth it, absolutely.
But Graham has highlighted what I think is going to be one of the, if not the, technology story of the 21st century, and it's the convergence of biology with engineering. And there are any number of examples I could give. The way I kind of frame it now is that looking at 9 billion people on the planet by 2050, we've got some pretty serious issues to address. Our energy demands are going to double. We will be feeding people on roughly 1/2 acre per person, so understanding how to produce food at that kind of pace. Clean water, of course, water everywhere, but darn it, It's got salt in it, so we can't drink it and we can't use it for irrigation. So figuring out how to desalinate water. And then, of course, the issues around healthcare are already quite daunting. They will be even more daunting as hundreds of millions of people, we hope, come out of poverty. So many of the solutions to these problems are going to be geopolitical. Some of them are going to be technological. And I see tremendous opportunities coming out of the convergence of engineering biology to address them. So I can give you fabulous examples from new approaches to diagnosing and treating cancer, nanoparticles that carry homing mechanisms that get them directly to a cancer cell, hidden from the body's defenses on their way, find the cancer cell, deliver the toxin that is specific for that cancer and not for the other cells in the body. In water, one of the technologies I'm really excited about, desalination has been an issue for chemical engineers by themselves. Clever filters that remove the salt from water. They're clever, but it's really expensive, it's really energy intensive. One of the themes of this convergence of biology and engineering is letting biology do the very hard work of figuring out how to do the task and just using it, not actually doing the hard work of figuring out gene by gene how we would engineer it. And Peter Agre at Johns Hopkins discovered a channel called aquaporin that passes only water through the cell wall. There are a couple of companies now, startup, that use the aquaporin molecule to actually provide the filtration device for desalination. Great example of the convergence of engineering biology. So I think this is an exciting, booming area. It's not new. People were working in biomedical engineering or variants of this in the middle of the 20th century, but it has certainly gained steam, gained enthusiasm, really gained possibility with all of the kinds of IT benefits that the general talked about, and certainly sequencing benefits that are now in hand. But what's going to prevent us from actually deploying these new technologies? And policy is a very big piece of this. Bob Solow, an MIT economist, won the Nobel Prize for demonstrating that half of the economic growth in the United States after World War II was attributed not to commodities, not to people, but to technology. So that was kind of the first demonstration of the power of technology in driving economic growth. To me, it's second nature. It clearly is not second nature to all the people who are making the budgeting allocations in Washington. American public does get this, but we've got a problem. So from a peak of federal investments in research and development in the mid-1960s, where we were investing about 2% of GDP, today we're down at about 0.8% of GDP. Now, if we look in aggregate about the amount of money as a nation we're spending on R&D, it's been roughly 3%. It's been pretty steady. And the drop in federal support has been covered by industrial support. It's fantastic. Fantastic, except that changing of the proportion of support means that we're spending more money on the development than on the early research. The blueprint for our innovation economy was actually put in place by Vannevar Bush. Fabulous piece of work he wrote, something called Science, the Endless Frontier, in response to FDR's question, how do we turn the technologies for war into technologies for peace? And in that, Bush says, we had this well of discoveries that we deployed during the war into technologies that won the war. The bomb, radar, sonar, the foundations of GPS. You go through all the technology wonders that we enjoy today. Many of them have their foundations in World War II investments for war. So we effectively did that. But Vannevar Bush said, that well of discoveries we have plumbed and it's dry and we need to refill it, and we need to refill it perpetually. So when we get research funding that reduces the early stage research and emphasizes the deployment of the research discoveries into technologies for the marketplace, that's great, getting these technologies in the marketplace, but we're draining the well, we're emptying the well. We've got to be sure that our federal policies support that. Another piece of making sure this whole system works is making sure we have a robust system of education that gives opportunity to all the young people in America, not just those who can afford a better education. And these are, again, public policies that if we don't get them right, we are going to be robbing from our children's and grandchildren's opportunities.
So, Paris, that probably takes it to you for a second, and then maybe back to David. In the handout here, you've got 10 sensible policy recommendations. The question, do we have a sensible policy maker that might do one of these? And if you were picking one or two or three that look most plausible, because this is to help us understand, it's great and I think fantastic to have a list of things that we should do if we were sane and sensible. But suppose we're just the good old USA doing more or less like what we're doing now.
Sure.
Talk about the obstacles as well as the opportunities, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So the list, there's 10 pieces to it, and it's sort of divided into 3 buckets. One of which, as Dr. Hockfield mentioned, is the human capital piece. So we talk about reforms to K-12 education, higher education, reforms to the immigration system, things like that. The second bucket is the innovation agenda. Also, Dr. Hockfield mentioned funding for federal R&D. Vannevar Bush's current organization of his vision, the National Science Foundation, NIH funding, patent reforms, that whole kind of set of recommendations. And then the third set is around physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure. We talk about motor fuel tax increases to pay for refurbishment, improvements to digital infrastructure, and some focus on cybersecurity as well. To Professor Allison's question, which is, first, I guess among these, what would you prioritize? And then second, how do we actually go about attacking some of these given the current political climate? I would say, I guess, two things to this. I would take the human capital pieces, particularly the non-immigration parts, and elevate those to the top. We were talking a little bit earlier about some work that was done by the Harvard economics faculty, by Professors Katz and Golden, about the role that education, particularly K through 12, and basic higher education played in both the innovativeness of the U.S. economy in the early part of the 20th century, early and mid, as well as the compression in wages and the growth of the middle class. And I would say that focusing on the K to 12 will not only have that impact again, but it's also something that, by definition, requires the least federal involvement. In fact, there's not even a great way for the federal government to get involved in K to 12 education. The federal Department of Education, for example, is prohibited from writing national curriculum guidelines. Only about 11% of total education funding comes from the federal government. So if you're looking to the states and the cities, which is where I see more movement on any of these things, for example, motor fuels tax or other areas, K to 12 education is really an area where states and cities can move ahead, and I think you've seen that. You've seen that in states like Massachusetts, which was a middle performer in 1993 when the Education Reform Act was passed, and is now, by most measures, the leading performer in the country. And I think there's enough proven sort of policies at the state level and at the local level that you could actually see some real movement there, regardless of Congress and what the federal government's doing.
Were you working, when you were working for Rahm Emanuel?
Yes.
Were you out there when he was doing the education work?
I taught high school in Chicago, and then when I was working directly for the administration, I was actually on the infrastructure side. But certainly the whole debate around
very
education.
sensible ideas on education, which of course were difficult, but I think he has actually pressed through and gotten them largely through.
Right.
And the idea that
increase
the
in
reason
school
we're
day.
behind, say, Asian students in test scores is that by the time you take the test score, Asian students have actually gone to school a year longer because they have longer school days and longer school years.
Right.
And I think he's made progress on that.
Yeah, I mean, so that's, I think, a great example of a city being able to extend the school day upwards of 30%. And so, I mean, that's a sort of a big bang solution. Chicago, of course, was starting from a relatively low base in terms of the number of minutes in the day. But those are the sorts of things I think you could see cities do, absolutely.
So David, as you've struggled with many intractable problems over the course of your career, where we're losing in Iraq, and all of a sudden you go there and we have a surge of both troops, but as you say, even more importantly, ideas, and lo and behold, something turns out different than you would have otherwise bet. Certainly that I was betting. Or you've been to Afghanistan, or you've been to CENTCOM. So if you think about on the one hand, how easy it is looking at Washington today to think this is a dysfunctional capital. I wrote a piece recently, said DC is rapidly becoming an acronym for dysfunctional capital. So I look at that and I think it's easy to have a good idea what to do. It's hard to get it to be done. So use your imagination and tell us for one or two or several, how would you think about actually getting it done?
I actually think that probably each of them, you have to focus on individual ideas. You have to find individual champions on Capitol Hill. We are literally working our way through now actually, let me back up and talk about the idea of what we call policy and legislative headwinds. So I hope we've convinced you reasonably that there is this extraordinary opportunity for the United States and indeed for North America, founded again on a lot of fundamentals compared to the rest of the world, but then founded on 4 incredible revolutions, again, which we are largely leading in that world. So you have this tremendous opportunity, and the question is, what is keeping us from capitalizing fully on that opportunity? And essentially, it's the issues that we have here, where we actually provide prescriptions. It's to deal with one of these legislative or policy headwinds. So it is education reform. If we don't reform education, if we don't prepare the workforce for future needs, and help those that are in the current economy whose jobs may go away because of robotics, we'll have a very different country. We won't have made the most of the opportunity. Immigration reform is a wonderful example. You know, we educate the best and brightest of the world. We subsidize it in most cases, and then we tell half of them when they apply for an H-1B visa that they can't stay in our country because they didn't win the lottery. I mean, it's a really insane policy. By the way, Canada will take all of them, and when I did another task force on North America for the Council on Foreign Relations, we were up there, and there are big billboards that say, can't get a US visa, you know, come to Canada, we'll take you. So these are all issues that prevent you from capitalizing fully on this extraordinary opportunity, and we've got to work our way through those. So what we're actually doing now, just to take this to the next step, is to look at each of these different issue areas and in more depth provide some rationale for it. So again, comprehensive immigration reform, not just the smart folks, but also unskilled workers. I mean, there are crops that have literally rotted in the fields of certain states in the past 2 years because they couldn't get enough unskilled workers because there wasn't a legal pathway for them to do that. And again, we've got to come to grips with those kinds of issues as difficult as they are. But I think having, you know, had some few close encounters with our capital, the nation's capital, and on Capitol Hill, I think that's the way that you have to go about it. I mean, you could also promote, for whatever it's worth, a grander scheme of doing away with gerrymandering in states, which I think has made the House of Representatives more partisan than perhaps it otherwise would be, with red states or red districts becoming bright red and blue districts becoming bright blue, and the center being much less than it was.
Susan, let me get you to address this a little bit too, because certainly through your career, but over 7 or 8 years as president of MIT, you must have served on 99 panels that said it's crazy not to be investing in seed corn research and development for the benefits. Look at Vannevar Bush.
Right.
So, but I mean, I think I've been part of panels on this for 20 years, and it seems like we haven't moved the needle very much. So, what do you think?
So, great question, and it was just the question on my mind for the general just now, which is that let me just turn into an anecdote, and then you'll understand, which is that you know, a lot of people, you know, say that, you know, it's online education, it's just great, it's going to transform education, and you know, the problem is, for academically ambitious kids, they have gone after the resources wherever they've been. Walked to, you know, the library in the snow. I mean, you know, back and forth, to uphill both ways. So, and the academically ambitious people around the world are picking up these online resources in ways that are just, I mean, it brings tears to my eyes. It's so fantastic. Our country, our problem isn't that there aren't high quality academic resources. We've got an ambition deficit. And so the question is, not, how you make more things available, it's how do we inspire our country around this issue? And I often joke about, I grew up under the shadow of Sputnik. So when I was a kid, man, we had a problem, and we were going to solve it, and we wanted you and you and you, all of us, we were going to be part of the solution. It was a very exciting time to have an inclination towards science and math, which I had as a little kid, but it's this idea of an ambition. It's something that you know better than any of us as a leader in our armed forces. And one of my questions really is, how can we inspire that kind of ambition in our country today? How are we going to, and it's not just simply we can be great again, we're going to be number one again. What is our purpose? And one of the things I find so exciting about your North American decades idea is, Canada, the United States, Mexico together represent a geopolitical footprint, geopolitical force that we have not really plumbed very well. And how do we organize ourselves to, in the cliche, make the world a better place, but, how do we inspire our children, the people of this country and the countries to our north and south, to really kind of, pull up your bootstraps and go after what is the thing we are trying to accomplish that, frankly, I think being able to articulate that would go a long way to providing a counterforce for some of the forces of disruption that we see emerging around the world.
I mean, it's a wonderful point, and I can answer it in terms of a military organization. You literally, as a commander, you are trying to establish a certain culture. And, when I've been privileged to be at the helm of an organization, we really did try to build a culture that was founded on a proposition that life is a competitive endeavor. And as one of my really profound infantry captains told me when I was a lieutenant colonel, he said, sir, winners win stuff now and then. And so we did actually try to win stuff. Now, by the way, sometimes you have to compete to be the best team player, not just the, the best overall. And you have to pick your moments for that as well. But how do you build a culture, in this case, in a country, in a society, is not something that I've actually grappled with, but I guess that the principles are very similar. I mean, it has to start with some big ideas. A leader has to distill those big ideas. I used to think there were 5, by the way, in a particular unit. That's about all you can handle. Doesn't mean you don't have others, but I used to counsel future battalion, brigade, division commanders to, no kidding, spend time figuring out what are the 5 areas of priority and what are the big ideas in each of those, and then how do you operationalize those? So now truly, you have to get programmatics and all the rest of that. And I'd like to think, for example, that if you went to, say, the infantry battalion that I was privileged to command in the Great 101st Airborne Division, that if you asked a soldier now 20 some odd years later, then what was Petraeus a nut about? He'd say, oh my God, Every time he talked to us, he always stressed, this physical fitness, small unit live fire, tactics, techniques, and procedures, so realistic that, of course, I got shot in one of them. Air assault tactics and techniques, discipline, and then ranger-related Ranger course, really, because we had this thesis that if you got a certain number of non-commissioned officer Rangers at a certain threshold, it just transforms the unit, which it does. 20 in a single infantry company is transformative. But I guarantee you they'd get at least 4 or 5 right 20 some odd years later. What are the big ideas for, the United States? I mean, I could tell what they are for the Belfer Center, maybe even for the Kennedy School of Government, but that's to say that that's reasonably profound.
But what's interesting?
You had it for MIT, sir.
So I only
and our
had
son
3.
benefited from
I got
it.
3. 3 was the advice I was given. 3 things say the same things again, and actually it was easy because the ideas came from the community and was reflecting back, the community's
It's
passion.
only easy once you've distilled them.
Yeah, that's true. But
easy, but
one of the
big
places
ideas are not
where we
easy
see it, so
until you do.
what is America? What is North America about? And I can tell you, one of the great resources for us has been our immigrants. I mean,
Sure.
many of us are only a generation or 2 from the people who came to the United States, giving up everything they had, and they get it, and they understand it, and it's why they are driven so hard. It's why they study so well. It's why they come to MIT to become the engineers and scientists and and leaders of the future. So we have just not done a very good job of articulating it for the people who have been dwelling here for a while. And I'm not sure, I have not really put my mind to the task of articulating what this North American forest would be, what it would do for not just all of us, but what it would do for the world.
I mean, part of the idea here, in all honesty, I mean, it didn't start out to be that way, but it's also, it gives you a degree of hope and optimism about the prospects for our great country. And really, again, it comes back to fundamentals. I mean, one of those is innovativeness is rewarded in the United States system. I mean, you can distill a whole bunch of these that we're very fortunate in founding fathers, or fortunate in, the fact that there's oil and gas and shale and a whole, but we're the ones that invented the technology to unlock it. So there's a lot of that, and maybe we honestly, no kidding, sit down and try to distill what are some really big ideas that make this place special, our country, North America, and how do you solidify those? How do you capitalize on those as well?
So Paris, we'll give you a comment. So here you graduate from Harvard, the college, then you go off to, Teach for America, yes?
That's right.
And you're teaching in Chicago, then you go to work.
Program invented by a Princetonian, I think, wasn't it?
I think so.
Not to get that in there, but.
We call it a small college to the south, but in any case.
Central New Jersey.
So what do you say about this?
About the sort of ambition
About this general
deficits or
topic, yeah.
I mean, I certainly take the point. While it is very hard, in my view, to replicate the kind of thing you had in the Cold War, where there was a very clear rallying point, which was this sort of patriotic sense of mission to the country, in the absence of something like the Soviet Union. And I think, to General Petraeus' point, it's easier to do in organizations that have some bound around them that's not an entire continent, or an entire country. So I think it's very, very hard to do in the absence of having something to define yourself against. And what I wonder with regard to thinking of the revolutions in this context of something that people can sort of see some pride or affiliation as North Americans with, and General Petraeus and I have talked about this, which is a lot of these revolutions really benefit folks who have education. They benefit the skilled workers. And in the case of the Cold War, you had people like Dr. Hockfield and others who could engage at a scientific level and pursue graduate education in science and feel like they were contributing to their country. You had other people who could enlist in the Army and at a much lower level of skill and feel as though they were contributing. And I wonder, when we think about the agenda that people could really rally behind, what's something that could appeal to everybody, not just people who are going to be able to take advantage of scientific revolutions or changes in the way the economy is functioning.
So we're soon to go to questions from the audience. There are 2 microphones on either side, and you should please line up. And there are 2 microphones in the loges. But since I see in the audience one of the members of the advisory committee that produced this project, Professor Megan O'Sullivan, maybe you want to go over there and make a comment or ask a question? No, since I think it's nice to see how people that were part of the product produced the product. So please.
Harvard's energy expert, among them.
Among other things. Yes.
Among other things, that's right.
First, I just want to thank you again for this great product and for the inspiration that it gives us all, particularly here at a School of Public Policy. And I wanted to ask about something that we spoke about a little bit earlier today, and that is your project has a lot of focus on energy, and energy is a driver of integration in North America. And I'm wondering where you see the issue of climate focusing in on that piece. Is it something that you think can help bring those 3 countries together? Is it something that works against the energy revolution, or is it something that can benefit from the technological advances that you identify?
Look, I think it's one that can bring the countries together. I'd like to think it is bringing the countries together. And there's another project I was involved in as a co-chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on North America. By the way, there's a lot of these North American revolving themes. I teach a course at the Honors College of the City University of New York called The Coming North American Decades. And it didn't appear quite so crystal clear when it was conceived, and the three amigos here at Harvard that Graham loaned me to help build this course did it 3 years ago, but it really has solidified during that time. But when it comes to the issues of climate, first of all, we did put a very brief mention in here about something that we think is needed nationally, and that is essentially minimums for certain issues connected with fracking in particular, but just any energy extraction, production. When it comes to areas that can affect more than one state, so if you think about the methane gas discharge issue connected with hydraulic fracturing and really the whole value chain for delivery, when you think about groundwater, the water that comes back, the fracking fluid, and making sure that it doesn't contaminate groundwater that flows throughout a whole ecosystem, those kinds of issues we think actually need to be addressed, while leaving certainly to the states those that are truly just the province of a particular state. But in that other project that we did for the Council on Foreign Relations, we talked quite extensively about certain issues that need to be addressed across boundaries. When you get into the issues of water that President Hockfield was talking about, I mean, these are going to become more, we already see it in certain parts of our country, obviously, and we saw it even before the historic drought that is now really into several years into the West, where you have rivers and aquifers and so forth that go across borders. You've really got to have some rules and regulations and agreements on how you're going to exploit those. And that's just one of a number of different examples that I think are the province of the continent, not just of the United States, although we've got to get our own big ideas right, and then we ought to get them implemented in our own country.
Susan, do you want to say a quick word on that?
Yeah, so I perhaps somewhat naively have dreamed that this issue around energy could be the rallying ambition, obviously not just for our country, but for our, the North American decades. Yep. Is there any way that we can get beyond the political battling to come together around a new energy plan for the country, or is it just too politically charged at this point to do that?
I think it's very charged. I actually think that what's happening, you know, sometimes there's a saying that policy isn't made, it accumulates. And I've been the recipient at various times in government life to implement policies that had accumulated. I think actually that there is an energy policy in the US that is accumulated, and Megan would be even more expert on this, frankly. But as you look at each of the incremental decisions that has been made by particularly the EPA, but also by the other elements of the Department of Energy, you gradually see an energy policy emerging. I mean, we're not going to get this term in Congress, I don't think, crude oil exports allowed, but we are already swapping our crude for Mexican crude, and you know, you're getting these incremental areas of progress. There was a lot of criticism that we're not exploiting the ability to export our bountiful natural gas, which is the lowest cost in the entire world and an insurmountable comparative advantage for us in certain industries. But by golly, there's, I forget how many LNG plants have now been approved all the way through the process, and now construction is ongoing for these LNG plants, which 4 or 5 years ago, they're on sites in some cases that 4 or 5 years ago there were going to be gasification plants because we thought we were going to be importing, not exporting, which shows you how dramatic the energy revolution has been in that space.
So that's policy accretion, but I'm thinking about a national ambition that you know, looks out a couple of decades and says we're going to transition from dominance in fossil fuels, where we now are. I would say that's a good thing, to dominance in alternative through having batteries that can really, you know, energy storage that can sustain a non-fossil fuel-based energy ecosystem.
I think there actually are elements of that as well. I think if you look at some of these are more than incremental. Some of these are pretty big decisions on goals for certain types of efficiency, and these are driving certainly as are the subsidies in some cases or tax breaks or whatever that give incentives for renewables, even though they're not yet completely competitive head up with, especially now since the energy revolution with fossil fuels.
Paris,
So,
wanna
you know,
say-
can you say there should be an overarching one? I'd love to see it. But it's interesting that this is actually emerging, and it's in a reasonably coherent fashion, I think. I don't know if Megan will give a head nod to that or not, but it's sort of a,
Which way is the head nodding?
the optimist,
Paris, yeah.
optimist in me got control.
Right. The one point I would add to that last piece is I think a lot of those technologies are largely an American story. Certainly the battery storage and a lot of the renewable development you see here. Professor O'Sullivan, for your question about integration, the one thing I think that we flagged as an area for real growth that you could see is Canadian and American sharing, particularly around hydropower, which currently is about 1% of U.S. grid electricity. There's a lot of efforts, particularly in New York and New England, to see that grow substantially.
There's actually a lot
this-
southern, across the southern border
And
too. I mean,
southern, too.
we have much lower cost electricity than does Mexico.
So
Let me-
if we were not doing this by stealth, you know, could this not become a national ambition of the sort that the race to the moon became that could motivate?
There's the next task force.
Okay. This gentleman, please introduce yourself and a short question.
Hi, my name is Ben, and I'm a Harvard alum. My question is for President Hockfield and General Petraeus. Clearly, patent law and the protection of intellectual property is very important, both domestically for encouraging the private sector to be an innovator, but also in the global context. So when we talk about these four areas and the topic of innovation, what changes need to be made in intellectual property, both domestically and abroad, to encourage further private sector innovation?
Let me take the first one, and I'll then toss it back to President Hockfield. I mean, what I would focus on, actually more than patent law, in terms of safeguarding our intellectual property, is coming to grips with the issue of cyber theft. Obviously, the focus is on China, in part just because President Xi is also coming to the States, but you know, it's estimated that China has stolen $1 trillion worth of intellectual property over the last decade or so, in an effort that is publicly known now, what was privately known to some of us, that this is an organized effort that is done by their version of NSA on steroids, and it is directed and focused on areas that will most support certain elements of the economy, in which decisions have been made to really make a push. So we have got to come to grips with that. I think the administration is coming soon to a theater near us with what will be the beginnings of, again, incremental steps. There will be sanctions probably after the visit is complete. But this is not just good old run-of-the-mill espionage, stealing military secrets, or that's all fair, I guess, but this is way, way beyond that. And it has such a profound effect, given the competitive nature of some of these different industries. So that's the one where I would focus. By the way, one of the issues that we say has to be dealt with is also cybersecurity legislation. That legislation's necessary because without it, you're just not going to get the kind of sharing between the experts in government and those in the business world that need that expertise, but without certain safeguards and underpinnings, in some cases guarantees, that you'll help them if they get in a tough spot and suffer real economic reverses as a result of it, as a result of going public and sharing what they've had.
Yeah, so I have only a little to add. I just want to commend you for the kind of the background of your question, which is understanding the importance of intellectual property protection and patent law. It's absolutely critical for people to prosecute these really, great new ideas and turn them into the marketplace. And as much as we can, it's a slow process, but reconciling our patent protection with those in the countries that at least agree with us that we need to have them is important, and we're making steps in that direction.
Gentleman in the loge.
Hello, my name is Lul Goshu. I am an MPP alum from last year. So thank you so much for this great document. It's a great vision, and you put a lot of hard work into it. So I just have a question. So I'm an American taxpayer, but I'm not a part of the military infrastructure, so I'm not necessarily aware of how our tax dollars are being used for American defense. And so what's frustrating to me is, in your document, you say that the two largest drivers of spending is Social Security and Medicaid. There's a lot of myths behind, how much money goes into military spending. So my question for you is, do you foresee a decrease in military spending in your vision? And when you do, could you quantify it?
Good question. David?
Yeah, certainly can't quantify it. I, in truth, didn't envision a reduction. The fact is that our tax base is increasing, our GDP is increasing, and candidly, the situation in the world has not gone in a heartening direction in recent years. In fact, if anything, over the last, since sequestration in particular was envisioned, and of course it was supposed to be so horrible that they'd look into the abyss and draw back and we'd all come to our senses and agree to a reasonable way forward. Sequestration is still looming out there. It's a particularly bad way to cut deficits. So I actually think that we've gone too far, in fact, with cuts in defense spending. We especially have if we're going to have sequestration. And again, that's a nonsensical way of making cuts, not just in defense, but in anywhere else. To give you an example, when I was the director of the CIA and we looked at sequestration just briefly because we thought surely no one will ever do this silly notion, we not only are you told to take a cut, in our case I think it was somewhere around a 9% cut. That's a very substantial cut.
It is, yeah.
Unexpected in the middle of the year. But you're also supposed to, they tell you how to take it. So we had to take it in, let's say 50, just hypothetically 50 different program areas. You have to take the same amount in each one of those. So you don't have the authority to say, not saying that we were going to do a moonshot in the CIA, but let's say you had the equivalent of a moonshot, really expensive, perhaps high return, worth doing. But if you compare that with investing in your human capital, which is still the core essence of what makes that place so great and special, you'd say, well, let's delay the moonshot for a year to get through sequestration and we'll keep investing in all this other stuff. Nope, can't do that. So again, we not only have to come to grips with spending, we have to do it in a rational way rather than a way that is a real meat cleaver
So
approach.
your book will acknowledge, hopefully your book will mention that?
There is a bigger report, I don't know, it's published, and there's actually some other versions of this out there
Here's the
as
copy of
well,
the
so,
report,
yep.
and you can get it on the Belfer Center website. Just go
But
belfercenter.org.
you're right that it's a once over lightly on that particular,
Okay,
This
thank you.
gentleman, please.
by what would need to be done. Yep.
Hi, my name is Andrew Kingsbury. I'm an extension school student. My question is for the general. First, thank you for your service, your career. I was looking at a photo earlier today. It had all your service ribbons on, your Class A's and everything. It was almost going over your shoulder, so that was pretty cool. But my question is regarding your story about the Rangers, the one with the 101st. You said there was like a key, kind of like a key ratio in order for them to kind of become role models and leaders and everything like that. So that's like my first half of the question. And how did the leadership, the officers like yourself, inspire the NCOs to become Rangers, if that was part of like your program?
Well, there always are incentives, and incentives include everything from recognition, which is a big deal, and constantly emphasizing and putting those who achieve something in lights and pinning medals on them and getting stories. I mean, we worked this every way we possibly could. And so for every one of these areas that we had emphasis, you told about this is what excellence is. This is what we'll do to try to get to excellence. This is what you get if you get excellence. Here's how we're going to facilitate it. So we actually ran in a single infantry battalion our own pre-ranger course, which no one else in the entire division did. We ultimately ended up at the end of 2 years that I was privileged to command the organization with more enlisted Rangers. It's really about the enlisted and the non-commissioned officer Rangers, because most of the officers are Ranger qualified in all the battalions in an organization like that. But we ended up with more enlisted Rangers in that single battalion than any other grouping, any other brigade of 3+ battalions had in it, just because of the sheer emphasis on this. And because of the effort, I mean, it's always a comprehensive approach. I mean, there's even someone that was sitting at the school's allocation office. The moment it opened each month, when they opened up, and we would sign up for every slot. And then we'd bet that we're going to fill them, and we did. And so you really have to push it, but it has to be something that you are fully invested in yourself. And I could list the number of techniques that we employed to really, really achieve this goal.
Was there like a key ratio or like percentage, I guess?
There was 20. If you hit a threshold of 20, by the way, then the company commander got an Army Commendation Medal, and his first sergeant did. So again, there was a whole series of these. If you got 20 enlisted Rangers in a company, for some reason it just transformed the unit.
How large is that
company is about 130 to 150 men in those days, all infantry units. And there was just something special about it. And we ended up having the highest number of enlisted Rangers in the entire U.S. Army in a single battalion outside of the 3 actual Ranger battalions in the Ranger Regiment.
Thank you.
This gentleman, please.
Hi, my name is Gavin Reynolds. I'm a freshman at Harvard College. Thank you all for being here. President Hockfield, you mentioned immigration reform a bit there. I'm the son of Jamaican immigrants, so I was just wondering, could you guys talk a little bit about how you think potentially the future of immigration reform could play a part in allowing Washington to capitalize on our tech revolutions, since it would allow more students from more countries to come here not only to study, but then afterward to work here?
Well, there are 3 broad categories, I think, that you have to look at. One is the very highly educated individuals that come to the United States and in most cases want to stay in the United States if they can. And the irony is that we generally subsidize a good proportion of those, and then we don't have a real guarantee of a visa for them. There's a terrific example. I was in India a couple of months ago, and the number 1 startup in India is done by an individual that's now got $3 billion in revenue just in its 2nd year, 3rd year. So I said, tell me about yourself. And he was about 27 years old. And he said, well, I went to school, did Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania. I had a startup there, and then I went out and I was working for Microsoft. And I had this IT skill and all this stuff, and then I was deported. Really? And he said, so I had to go to India, so I dreamed up this little startup, and we now have $3 billion in revenue. So perfect example of what we should not do. And the bottom line is that we typically have twice as many applicants for the H-1B, the smart people's visa, as we have visas that we actually allow. The other end is, again, the unskilled, essentially, or very low-skilled workers that we really need in certain sectors of the economy, agriculture being among them. And again, we really don't have a very good legal pathway to really speed that process, particularly for certain harvest seasons and everything else. So that's the other one. And then you have to address the issue of those who are here illegally, essentially, and that's as many as over 10 million people, certainly, the majority of which are tax-paying contributors to our society with jobs and all the rest of that. And again, we've got to have a pathway to citizenship for them as well, not one that rewards them necessarily in a particular way for having done something that is illegal, but nonetheless you have to have a pathway for them also. And this is one that we actually have thought through to some degree. It has actually been proposed. The number of senators were behind this, some quite courageously from their parties. And then, unfortunately, it just lost airspeed and altitude and didn't get across the finish line.
Yeah, I don't know what the political solution is, but from my own view, the need to get a solution becomes more pressing almost monthly. So our immigration policies now are very little different from what they were like 25 years ago. And from where I sit, the people who come to this country, get educated, their number 1 choice 25 years ago, for most of them, was to stay in the United States. Number 2 choice was a really distant second, but they couldn't say they might go, but they fought like heck to stay. The situation has changed. We've got some incredibly great competition in other countries, and So you don't get your number one choice, easy enough to go to your number two choice. There are a lot of great places to be an innovator, an entrepreneur, and the United States is just losing a tremendous resource in not making it possible for the high-end immigrants to stay, and I'm, in my view, making a huge mistake in not having a path for the unskilled workers to come, because, you know, I see the sons and daughters of those people at MIT every year, and they are amazing people, I'm sure, like yourself, and we need a path for them to come to the United States as well. But politically, it's there is not an easy political solution.
You know, again, demographics are one of those real fundamentals that you just can't outrun. And Japan is trying to figure its way out through that now, but you know, they're in a situation where the 130 million people population, within a few years, decades certainly, they'll be losing 1 million people per year out of their population because of the decline in their demographics, unless they figure out some way to come to grips with that. And the bottom line is, if your population, really your workforce, if your workforce is going like this and productivity is not going like that, GDP is going to follow the demographic trend. There are a lot of countries that are in a serious situation. China actually is losing 4 to 5 million people a year out of its workforce because of the effects of the one-child policy, which have been tweaked but not really reversed at all yet. Many European countries, at least until the refugee crisis, there is some benefit to this refugee crisis for those European countries that allow these people to settle there and then can obviously integrate them successfully into the society. But otherwise, they've got a demography, by and large, that's going like that as well.
This gentleman, please.
Hi, Mark Slimiani. I'm a mid-career student at the Kennedy School. My question to the panel is reference to risk and reward in innovation. Particularly, you know, government funds very risky innovation that the private sector would not conduct, and yet many of the returns are privatized. This is kind of a major thesis in the work by Mariana Mazzucato in The Entrepreneurial State about the privatization of whether it's Apple, whether it's private equity and venture capital in some regards. How do we develop mechanisms that return some of that profit back into innovation?
You know, interestingly, I think, and I actually am a part-time venture capitalist now too, thanks to what I do in New York. And I actually think there is a ton of money out there. There's staggering amounts of money that are looking to invest in promising startups. And it's not, and certainly some of those are coming from stuff that's thrown over the transom from DARPA and IARPA and In-Q-Tel. You know, there's actually a venture, nonprofit, independent venture capital organization called In-Q-Tel, which gets appropriated funds, publicly known, from the CIA, modest amount every year, and has invested those so incredibly well, including the first million in Palantir, which is now, I don't know, a $15 to $20 billion company, that they have enabled a great deal of this also. So I don't know if that's how you turn that back to the government in a sense. I would think there are ways to do that. I can tell you that at USC, where I do some time each semester as well, that USC, and we've been working on this, and I actually review now 8 startups per semester when I'm out there. And this time I'm going to bring USC alumni venture capitalists with me, and we're going to turn it into a Shark Tank and right on the spot commit to supporting or not to support. But USC gets 5% of every startup that they help launch because of their incubator that we built over the last few years out there. It's very exciting stuff. So I don't know if that's the root of, there should be a way though of, I mean, you know, I don't know what DARPA got for creating the internet or what the CIA got for creating what ultimately was Google Earth. But a lot of these have had their start there. So it's an interesting question. You want to try it, Paris?
Yeah, I think what you hit on there is that it's a lot easier for universities and the intermediary to take equity in the eventual organization than it's going to be for the original funder, the U.S. government. And I think after 1980, when Bayh-Dole is passed, and you actually do see a dramatic increase as a result of tech transfer in development and things actually getting to market. And I think there are things you can do at the university level, taking equity and taking shares of companies. Personally, I'm skeptical that it's a good idea to allow the National Science Foundation to.
Susan,
Yeah.
you lived in a,
Tell us about that.
I'm afraid you lived in the middle of that.
Called
Yeah.
MIT.
So
And you also have labs like Lincoln.
yeah, per my earlier comments, the funding of early stage research, before you have any idea where the heck it's going to turn up, that is the province of the government, and it's something the United States has done very well. We've backed off from it just at the time when there's more opportunity. And again, this is another place where there's a lot of competition. I can give you the numbers. There are a lot of countries around the world that are accelerating their investments. The United States, Canada are backing off on those investments. But one of the things that I worry about in this space, and I am a fan of our model of people investing. There's a lot of money out there to be invested. Right now, my big concern about this money out there to be invested is that our policies encourage short-termism. And so if you can, equal tax benefit if you invest for 13 months or invest for 13 years, it doesn't take an economist to tell you, where you're going to be putting your money and making it from. So one of my concerns about economic growth in the United States is policies and practices that are discouraging for people to put their money into long cycle, capital intensive businesses. At MIT, we spin out a lot of companies that make stuff, not social media. There are companies that spin out and do social media also, but there are just a lot of companies that make big stuff. And when I was co-chairing the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership with Andrew Liveris for the White House, we did a session with entrepreneurs, manufacturing entrepreneurs. I love these people. I mean, how audacious is it to think you can go out and make cars in a different way, or frankly make batteries in a different way. And they have a really hard time, long cycle, capital intensive, to build a manufacturing plant. Easy to do the startup phase. So when we talk to MIT alumni about how they start their companies, the startup phase is very fundable, but the scale-up phase is just really hard. And so there are powerful economic disincentives in our country today from actually funding the future of manufacturing. And that's one of my big concerns. It's not that there isn't money around. There aren't people interested in getting involved in the hurly-burly of innovation and entrepreneurship. It's that second stage that we really have to develop. And it's not a surprise that a lot of the companies, when they get to scale up, are moving offshore. And so that's something that really does concern me about whether we're funding companies to stay in place, build manufacturing. There aren't going to be as many manufacturing jobs tomorrow as there were 25 years ago, but there are going to be jobs. But there aren't going to be jobs if we don't have the industry developing here.
Andy Grove, who founded Intel, has said often that if he were doing it again today, he would start it up in California and he would scale it up in China.
Yeah, he'd have to.
Please.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Charlie, and I'm a senior at the college. My question is for Paris, who, by the way...
Are you really in Harvard ROTC?
I am, sir. One of the
Good.
few.
Good for you.
She's the head
Army
of the, she's the
ROTC,
head of
sir.
the-
My question is for Paris, who, by the way, is a really exceptional TF, if you ever have the opportunity to, as your teacher. So last semester in economics, we talked a lot about American debt and the debt to GDP ratio as being something that could potentially tie the hands of America going into the future as it continues to rise. So my question is two parts. The first is, do you think that our debt could hamper our ability to capitalize on America's 4 tech revolutions? And second, do you think that if we were to capitalize on these tech revolutions, it would potentially raise our GDP enough or increase our tax revenue enough to lower our debt to GDP ratio in a substantial way?
Yeah, great questions. I think the answer to both is yes. And I think that's why if you look at the set of recommendations that we laid out, there's both reforms to the primary drivers of spending, entitlement programs namely, and there's a question earlier about defense. Defense is large, but if you look at what's the drivers of the deficits in the out years, going out to 2030, it's primarily the federal entitlement program. So we called for reforms to those, but I think you're right with your second question, which is the faster way to reduce the debt to GDP ratio and to stabilize it ultimately isn't necessarily just to rein in federal spending, though that's a part of it. It's really to get GDP moving, as we were talking about earlier, sort of away from the 2% that we've seen for the past decade roughly and trying to get back to sort of the long run equilibrium of 3%, which may not be the long run equilibrium anymore. And I think the tech revolutions are a very important part of that.
Yeah, so can I just agree emphatically? Let's focus on economic growth. And we've got to trim, but we've got to figure out what our policies are. They're going to drive economic growth big time.
This gentleman, please.
Hi, my name is Vaibhav and I'm a first year student at the business school. And the question is actually to all four of you, which is if you look at Asia as such, the post-internet generation, which is called the Generation Z, is now coming up in the market. And that's the first generation which is will be growing up with the internet rather than having adapted to it. And till now, most of the consumer internet startups in Asia have been, to borrow Peter Thiel's language, 1 to N kind of startups. So you have relatively very few original ideas or 0 to N kind of startups happening there. And that's a market which is still very US dominated. Do you see that changing in the next decade or 2 decades? And what can the US do for that to still, for original ideas to still come up here, at least for the majority of them? Thank you.
That's a wonderful question, actually, and I'm thinking it through and actually thinking of some of the startups that have really taken off, and you actually have captured it, that a lot of them are, so what did Jack Ma do? He did what Amazon has done, arguably. But I don't know that that's necessarily wrong. I don't think it was an intellectual property issue. I mean, you just took a big idea, but you've got a society of consumers that is growing. So even though China's slowing down, it's going to have the biggest middle class ultimately, presumably, in the world. And there is a growing desire to buy a whole bunch of things that would be attractive in that regard. So you have to look differently when you're investing in China. And the firm in which I'm a partner, we've got at least 16 huge investments there. But we've tried to have a thesis about the growth that is, this is stuff that people are going to want. Even if the GDP growth slows, you're still going to have an expanding pool of middle class, and they will still want this. And I think that's what has been done there. Now, whether that'll get the spark of the absolute new, I just have to think they will, with one possible challenge, and that is, I think, a question whether a country can create the ecosystem in which that takes place if it doesn't allow the people in that ecosystem access to all information around the world. And if I were in China, I'd be very concerned that not allowing Google to search everything or not allowing this or that newspaper or whatever in there would ultimately actually put the country's innovators at a comparative disadvantage. So it really depends. I think this is an information world, and if you don't have access to all the information for perhaps political or other reasons, does that hamper the ability to do what you were talking about? And that's an unanswered question. Just as it has been unanswered about how long could China's economic model actually continue to grow, and we're starting to get the answer to that now. Keep in mind, by the way, when we talk about debt to GDP ratio, China has a 270 plus debt to GDP ratio that has to be unwound at some point in time. That's a fundamental you can't outrun. And again, you can say, well, look, again, it's financed by Chinese the same way we finance our deficit. But all that means is, again, when the haircut's taken, once again, it's going to be domestic Chinese that are going to suffer. So these are the kinds of big fundamentals that ultimately do have to be dealt with. And if growth is slowing, then you have a hard time growing out of that. So that's yet another issue that's going to have to be confronted.
I look to the future of Asia with great optimism and a little bit of competitive fear. And the measure I use is investments in education and research. The educational institutions in Asia and China, frankly, even Japan, Singapore, are moving forward at astonishing paces. So I think that we're going to see a tremendous amount of indigenous innovation happen in these countries. And I just, you can't prevent it. It's going to be it is very exciting right now, and it's just going to, the momentum's going to grow.
So we're going to take two last
I mean, to
questions.
say
that are up.
quickly, the country to watch, by the way, I think is India, because it's the country that has this immense potential, not yet realized, but yet it's not at all certain that the Prime Minister Modi's got big ideas. They're very powerful. He did it running the state of Gujarat. I've sat with him recently and heard, he's got it. The question is whether he can get them through the bureaucracy and then indeed implement them in a very challenging bureaucracy. If he can, that's the country. It's going to be bigger ultimately than China. It's got tremendous demographics, but that also means it needs a tremendous amount of new jobs every year. So it'd be a very interesting one. And it does have some very high level education,
But they haven't
but
gotten
it's
their,
limited.
they haven't developed a plan for an expansion and
That's right.
building their educational infrastructure the way China has.
That's right.
And
Yes,
frankly,
yeah. I mean, it's totally different in the whole system.
Yeah.
But if they can get it going, it's going to be because it has the potential.
I will be reserved. We're taking two last questions. The two ladies on the floor, please, short questions and short answers, please.
I'm Eun-Jung Lee, CEO of Harvard Robotics Startup, developing internal pipeline repair robot. I'm telling you from my own experience, and like Professor Hockfield mentioned, the industry is increasing their investment in development. In other words, if the technology readiness level is above 3, in NASA's technology readiness level between 1 and 10. So we cannot expect industry funding if we are below level 3.
Yeah.
And also, venture capitalists are enthusiastic only if you have robot prototype in your hand or in your lab, or if you can generate revenue after at least 2 years. And government comes in and they have a variety of program only to provide $500,000 or $1 million in the beginning. But if we are developing game-changing or disruptive technology, it doesn't really take only half or 1 million. It can take easily 20 to 50 millions. So I'm really wondering, can Washington capitalize on America's revolutionary technology? And whom to talk to?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well
Susan,
said.
yes.
Well said. You just kind of restated my biggest concern, which is, are we investing in the kind of technologies that are going to provide the economic growth and jobs growth that we need? And I agree that there is a gap there, and we have not figured out how to solve it. Although there are a number of companies that are co-investing. So big companies are co-investing in small companies to help bring them along. And I think that's one area for further development. Great hope that companies understand they can't do it in-house, but they can invest in a small company that's coming along in an industry that they're going to that they're going to want to incorporate.
And there are programs that the government supports that are gradually increasing in number for, I think they're called engineering centers of excellence. And often link together a couple or 2 or 3 different universities in a particular area, and are trying to promote those. There's intense competition to be the schools that get that, and that is actually proceeding also. So it's a surprising number of programs that are actually out there that people haven't heard about unless they're actually in the business of trying to attract that funding.
Last question, please.
Hi, I'm Rosalie Waxman. I work in international marketing and sales for a healthcare startup in India. My question is actually about Mexico, though. In terms of achieving the goals for the North American decades, I'm sure that this has been addressed, but I was just curious to get the insights of the panel in terms of the level of corruption in the Mexican government and some of the issues they're dealing with that the US and Canada does not deal with on a regular basis, and how the North American countries could come together to achieve these goals with that obstacle.
It's a phenomenal question, and I've spent a lot of time in Mexico. Actually, I think at one point I was down there 5 times in 6 months or something like that. And it was for a combination of Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on North America, an American-Mexico CEO Council, and then, frankly, the diligence on investments that we are considering, some of which are enormous. And the challenges are considerable, but again, what excited me about Mexico, in again these years that I've been doing this, recently in particular, is that President Peña Nieto got into office. He got 16 constitutional reforms done in his first year through, and that takes, I think it's a 2/3 majority, and so he cobbled together a coalition to do that. Unprecedented in Mexican history. That's more than his 3 predecessors did in 18 years. He did it in 1 year. The next year, he got all of the implementing legislation through. That only requires a majority. And now they're into the implementation. Tragically, of course, there have been really serious security issues that have cropped up in the last year in particular. For example, the killing of the 50 or so student teachers in a horrific case, and a number of others. And these have highlighted the persistence of what really is a rule of law problem. It is not just corruption, it's not just illegal narcotics industries, it's bigger than that. These are criminal cartels that will do anything they can. And by the way, they're empires, and that means they have to continue to expand, and that means they collide with other empires. But they're constantly seeking new sources of ill-gotten gains. And they'll do something, even in the middle of a city, go up to someone with a pistol and say, let's go to the ATM and draw out all your money, as a new variation on the theme. Now, there is, among the reforms, there is reform to the legal system, to the judicial system, that will change the way it works. Hopefully we'll get a higher conviction rate than the 5% or whatever it is right now for a number of different crimes. And we'll also reform some of the other organizations. The problem is that the task is so daunting when you look at it, and I looked at it in my last government position, to help the Mexican government. I mean, this is like taking on a massive insurgency, and you therefore need a counterinsurgency to do it, but it's hugely resource intensive. And I remember one time telling the previous president, who was talking about, and he's one of your fellows, in fact, rightly, talking about a real legacy program that they'd trained and equipped and so forth, 25,000 federal police, huge accomplishment, because you need federal level, not local, which gets too easily corrupted, intimidated, or killed. And said, that's really terrific. By my calculation, all you need is another 225,000. So to give you some sense, again, of the challenges that are posed there. And the Peña Nieto government is trying to tackle these, but and they're not insurmountable, as you can see in Monterrey, which is a sort of a unique set of circumstances. Maybe in Juarez, yes, I think also in at least one other area, Tijuana. But it's a really, really serious issue that takes comprehensive efforts. It's not just a security problem, it's not just a judicial problem, it's not just a penitentiary problem. And you saw, the drug kingpin actually burrows his way out of the, I mean, how can that possibly happen? But it's bigger than that. It's education, it's basic services, it's opportunity, and all the rest. And so it is it's very much akin to what's needed in a counterinsurgency. And that becomes so daunting that you almost draw back from it rather than just, and you realize, by the way, it gets much harder before it gets easier, as we saw actually in the Iraq surge. And we said it would, and it did, but then you do have the massive drop-off if you can come to grips with it. But that's the challenge there, and enormous potential. It is a place where you definitely can do business, and safely, but you have to know the risks, and there are risk premiums on certain of the activities down there big time.
So I'm sorry to bring this to an end, but we're to the witching hour. What a pleasure it's been for all of us here to have General Petraeus and his team producing this great report. I would recommend you read the whole report again. You can get it just at belfercenter.org. And I thank the members of the advisory committee. I didn't see Vinky was over here, but the advisory committee for the project was Vinky, Susan, and Megan. So we thank you for your work too. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Wonderful.
You did good.